Page 277, Chapter 7, in the engine room. The box adjacent to the so-called Butyrki station was the famous frisking box, where new arrivals were searched. It had space enough for 5 or 6 jailers to process up to 20 Zeks in one batch. Now, however, it was empty, and the rough-hewn search tables had nothing on. Over at one side of the room, seated behind a small, nondescript table beneath a small lamp, was a neat, black-haired NKVD major. Patient boredom was what his face chiefly revealed. The intervals during which the Zeks were brought in and let out one by one were a waste of his time. Their signatures could have been collected much, much faster. He indicated that I was to sit down on the stool opposite him on the other side of his table. He asked my name. To the right and left of the inkwell lay 2 piles of white papers, the size of a half-sheet of typewriter paper, all looking much the same. In format, they were just like the fuel requisitions handed out in apartment house management offices, or warrants in official institutions for purchase of office supplies. Leafing through the pile on the right, the major found the paper which referred to me. He pulled it out and read it to me in a bored patter. I understood I had been sentenced to 8 years. Immediately he began to write a statement on the back of it with a fountain pen, to the effect that the text had been read to me on the particular date. My heart didn't give an extra half beat. It was all so everyday and routine. Could this really be my sentence? A turning point in my life? I would like to feel nervous to experience this moment to the full, but I just couldn't. And the major had already pushed the sheet over to me, the blank side facing up, and a school child's 7-kopeck pen with a bad point that had lint on it from the inkwell lay there in front of me. No, I have to read it myself. Do you really think I would deceive you? The major objected lazily. Well, go ahead, read it. Unwillingly, he let the paper out of his hand. I turned it over and began to look through it with deliberate slowness, not just word by word, but letter by letter. It had been typed. But what I had in front of me was not the original, but a carbon. Extract from the decree of the OSO of the NKVD of the USSR of July 7th, 1945. It was all underscored with a dotted line, and the sheet was vertically divided with the dotted line. Case heard. Accusation of so-and-so. Name, year of birth, place of birth. Decreed. To the designate for so-and-so. Name for anti-Soviet propaganda and for an attempt to create an anti-Soviet organization. 8 years in corrective labor camp. Copy verified, Secretary. Line to be signed. Was I really just supposed to sign and leave it in silence? I looked at the major to see whether he intended to say something to me, whether he might not provide some clarification. No, he had no such intention. He had already nodded to the jailer and the door to get the next prisoner ready. To give the moment at least a little importance, I asked him with a tragic expression, "But really? This is terrible. 8 years? What for?" And I could hear how false my own words sounded. Neither he nor I detected anything terrible. Right there, the major showed me once again where to sign. I signed. I could simply not think of anything else to do. In that case, allow me to write an appeal right here. After all, the sentence is unjust. As provided by regulations, Major assented with a nod, placing my sheet of paper on the left-hand pile. "Let's move along," commanded the jailer, and I moved along. I had not really shown much initiative. Georgie Tenno, who, to be sure, had been handed a paper worth 25 years, answered, "After all, this is a life sentence. In olden times, they used to beat the drums and assemble a crowd when a person was given a life sentence. And here, it's like being on a list for soap ration. 25 years, and run along." Arnold Rappaport took the pen and wrote on the back of the verdict, "I protest categorically this terroristic illegal sentence and demand immediate release." The officer who had handed it to him had at first waited patiently, but when he read what Rappaport had written, he was enraged and tore up the paper with the note on it. So what? Term remained in force anyways. This was just a copy. Vera Kornaeva was expecting 15 years, and when she saw with delight that there was a typo on the official sheet, it read only 5. She laughed her luminous laugh and hurried to sign before they took it back. The officer looked at her dubiously. "Do you really understand what I read to you?" Yes, thank you very much. 5 years in corrective labor camps." The 10-year sentence of Janos Rosas, a Hungarian, was read to him in the corridor in Russian, without any translation. He signed it, not knowing that it was his sentence, and he waited a long time afterward for its trial. Still later, when he was in camp, he recalled the incident very vaguely and realized what had happened. I returned to the box with a smile. It was strange. Each minute, I became jollier and more relieved. Everyone was returning with 10-ruble bills, including Valentin. The lightest term in our group that day had been given to the bookkeeper, who had gone out of his mind. He was still, in fact, beside himself, and the lightest term after his was mine. In the splashes of sun and the July breeze, the little twig outside the window continued to bop up and down as gaily as before. We chatted boisterously, here and there, more and more frequently. Laughter resounded in the box. We were laughing because everything had gone off so smoothly. We were laughing at the shocked bookkeeper. We were laughing at our morning hopes, and at the way our cellmates had seen us off and arranged secret signals with us to be transmitted by food parcels, 4 potatoes or 2 bagels. Well, anyway, there is going to be an amnesty, several affirmed. All this is just for form's sake, and it doesn't mean anything. They want to give us a good scare, so we'll keep in line, Stalin told an American correspondent. What was his name? I don't remember his name. So they ordered us to take our things, formed us up by twos, and led us once again through the same marvelous little park filled with summer. And where did they take us? Once again to the baths. And oh, what a peal of laughter that got. My God, what silly nincompoops. Still roaring, we undressed, hung our duds on the same trolley hooks, and rolled them into the same roller coaster they'd already been rolled into that morning. Roaring, each of us took a small sliver of repulsive soap and went into the spacious, resonant shower room to wash off our girlish gaiety. We splashed about in there, pouring hot, clean water on ourselves, and we got to romping about as if we were school kids who had come to the baths after their last exam. This cleansing, relieving laughter was, I think, not really sick, but a living defense for the salvation of the organism. As we dried ourselves off, Valentin said to me, reassuringly, intimately, "Well, all right. We're still young. We are going to live a long time yet. The main thing is not to make a misstep now. We are going to a camp and will not say one word to anyone so they don't plaster the news on us. We will work honestly and keep our mouths shut. And he really believed in this program, the naive little kernel of grain cupped between Stalin's millstones. He really had his hopes set on it. One wanted to agree with him, to serve out the term cozily, and then expunge from one's head what one had lived through. But I had begun to sense the truth inside myself. If in order to live it is necessary not to live, then what's it all for? One cannot really say that the OSO had been conceived after the revolution. Catherine the Great had sentenced the journalist Novikov, whom she disliked, to 15 years on, one might say, an OSO basis, since she didn't turn him over to a court. And all the Tsars, once in a while, in a fatherly way, exiled without any trial those who had incurred their displeasure. In the 1860s, a basic court reform took place. It seemed as if rulers and subjects had both begun to develop something like a juridical view of society, and yet in the 70s and 80s, Korolenko tracked down cases where administrative repression had usurped the role of judicial judgment. In 1872, he himself and 2 other students were exiled without trial on the orders of the Deputy Minister of State Property, a typical case of an OSO. Another time, he and his brother were exiled without trial to Glasgow. Korolenko has also given us the name of one Fyodor Bogdan, an emissary from the peasants, a Kadok, who got right up to the Tsar himself and was then exiled. And of Piankov, too, who was acquitted by a court and yet exiled by order of the Tsar. And there were several others as well. And Vera Zasulich explained in a letter sent after she emigrated that she had not run away from that court and a trial, but from non-judicial administrative repression. That's the tradition of the dotted line, the administratively issued sentence dragged on, but it was too lax. It was suitable for a drowsy Asiatic country, but not for a country that was rapidly advancing. Moreover, it lacked any definite identity. Who was the OSO? Sometimes it was the Tsar, sometimes it was the governor, sometimes the deputy minister. And if it was still possible to enumerate names and cases, this was not, begging your pardon, real scope. Real scope entered the picture with the 20s, when permanently operating troika panels of 3, operating behind closed doors, were created to bypass the courts permanently. In the beginning, they even flaunted it proudly, troika of the GPU. Not only did they not conceal the names of the members, they publicized them, who, on the Solovetsky Islands, did not know the names of the famous Moscow troika, Glebocki, Vol and Vasiliev. Yes, and what a word it was, in fact, troika. It bore a slight hint of sleigh bells on the shaft bow, celebration of Shrovedite, and interwoven with all of its a mystery. Why troika? What did it mean? After all, a court wasn't a quartet either, and a troika wasn't a court. And the biggest mystery of all lay in the fact that it was kept out of sight. We hadn't been there. We hadn't seen it. All we got was a piece of paper. Sign here. The troika was even more frightening than a revolutionary tribunal. It set itself even further apart muffled itself up and locked itself in a separate room, and soon concealed the names of its members. Thus we grew used to the idea that the Troika members didn't eat or drink or move about among ordinary people. Once they had isolated themselves in order to go into session, they were shut off for good, and all we knew of them was their sentences handed out through typists. And they had to be returned too. Such documents couldn't be left in the hands of individuals. These troikas we use the plural just in case, because as with the deity, we never know where or in what form it exists. Satisfied a persistent need that had arisen, never to allow the arrested to return to freedom. This was like an OTK, a Department for Quality Control in Industry, but in this case it was attached to the GPU to prevent any spoiled goods. If it turned out that someone was innocent and could therefore not be tried at all, then let him have his -32 via the Troika, which meant he couldn't live in any of the provincial capitals, or let him spend 2 or 3 years in exile, after which he would have a convict's clipped ear, would always be a marked man, and from then on a recidivist. Please forgive us, reader. We have once more gone astray with this rightist opportunism, this concept of guilt, and of the guilty or innocent. It has, after all, been explained to us that the heart of the matter is not personal guilt, but social danger. One can imprison an innocent person if he is socially hostile, and one can release a guilty man if he is socially friendly, but lacking legal training. We can be forgiven for the 1926 code, according to which, my good fellow, we lived for 25 years and more, was itself criticized for an impermissible bourgeois approach, for an insufficiently class-conscious approach, and for some kind of bourgeois weighing of punishments in relation to the gravity of what had been committed. Unquote. Alas, it is not for us to write the absorbing history of this particular organ, how the troikas turned into OSOs, or when they got renamed, or when there were OSOs in provincial centers, or just one of them in the Great Palace, or which of our great and proud leaders were members, or how often they met and how long their sessions lasted, whether or not they were served tea while they worked, and if they were, what was served with the tea, and how the work itself proceeded. Did they converse while it was going on or not? We are not the ones who will write this history, because we don't know. All that we have heard is that the essence of the OSO was triune, and even though it was still impossible to name its industrious members, yet we do know the 3 organs permanently represented there. One member represented the Central Committee of the party, one the MVD, and one the Chief Prosecutor's Office. However, it would not be a miracle if we should learn someday that there were never any sessions, and that there was only one staff of experienced typists composing extracts from non-existent records of proceedings, and one general administrator who directed the typists. As for typists, there were certainly typists, that we can guarantee. Up to 1924, the authority of the Troika was limited to sentences of 3 years maximum. From 1924 on, they moved up to 5 years of camp. From 1937 on, the OSO could turn out 10-ruble bills, and after 1948, they could rivet a quarter, 25 years on you. And there were people, Shatterov, for example, who know that during the war years, they also even sentenced prisoners to execution by shooting. Nothing unusual about this. The OSO was nowhere mentioned in either the Constitution or the Code. However, it turned out to be the most convenient kind of a hamburger machine, easy to operate, undemanding, and requiring no legal lubrication. The Code existed on its own, and the OSO existed on its own, and it kept on deftly grinding without all the Code's 205 articles, neither invoking them nor even mentioning them. And they used to joke in camp, there is no court for nothing, for that there is an OSO. Of course, the OSO itself needed, for convenience, some kind of operational shorthand, but for that purpose it worked out its own 12-letter article, which made operations very much simpler. It wasn't necessary when they were used to cudgel your brains trying to make things fit the formulations of the Code, and there were few enough to be easily remembered by a child. Some of them we have already described. ASA, anti-Soviet agitation; KRD, counter-revolutionary activity; KRTD, counter-revolutionary Trotskyite activity, and that T made the life of the second camp much harder. PSH, suspicion of espionage that went beyond the bounds of suspicion, was handed over to a tribunal. SVPSH, contact leading to the suspicion of espionage. KRN, counter-revolutionary thought. VAS, dissemination of anti-Soviet sentiments. SOE, socially dangerous element. SVE, socially harmful element. PD, criminal activity, a favorite accusation against former camp inmates if there was nothing else to be used against them. And then finally, there was a very expansive category, THS, member of a family of a person convicted under one of the foregoing letter categories. It has to be remembered that these categories were not applied uniformly and equally among different groups and in different years. But as with the articles of the Code and the sections in the special decrees, they broke out in sudden epidemics. There is one more qualification. The OSO did not claim to be handing down a sentence. It did not sentence a person, but instead it imposed an administrative penalty. And that was the whole thing in a nutshell. Therefore, it was, of course, natural for it to have judicial independence. But even though they did not claim that the administrative penalty was a court sentence, it could be up to 25 years and include deprivation of titles, ranks, and decorations, confiscation of all property, imprisonment, and deprivation of the right to correspond. Thus, a person could disappear from the face of the earth with the help of the OSO even more reliably than under the terms of some primitive court sentence. The OSO enjoyed another important advantage in that its penalty could not be appealed. There was nowhere to appeal to. There were no appeals jurisdiction above it, and no jurisdiction beneath it. It was subordinate only to the Minister of Internal Affairs, to Stalin, and to Satan. Another big advantage of the OSO that the OSO had was speed. Speed was limited only by the technology of typewriting. And last but not least, not only did the OSO not have to confront the accused face to face, which lessened the burden of in-person transport, it didn't even have to have its photograph. At the time when the prisons were badly overcrowded, this was a great additional advantage because the prisoner did not have to take up space on the prison floor or eat bread. Once his interrogation had been completed, he could be sent off to camp immediately and put to honest work. The copy of the sentence could be read to him much later. It used to be that in favorable conditions, the prisoners were unloaded from freight cars at their destinations, and they were made to kneel down right there next to the tracks as a precaution against attempted escape. But it looked as if they were praying to the OSO, and their sentences were read out to them. It could also happen differently. In 1938, those who arrived at Peribori on prisoner transports did not know either their code articles or their sentences, but the clerk who met them knew. He looked them up on the list. SVE, socially harmful element, 5 years. That was during the time when there was an urgent need for many hands to work on the Moscow-Volga Canal. Oh, God. Others worked in the camps for months without knowing their sentences. After this, as I Dobriak reported, they were solemnly lined up, and not just on any old day, but on May 1st, 1938, when the red flags were flying, and the Stalino province troika sentences were announced. This would indicate that the OSO did get decentralized in times of heavy load. These sentences were from 10 to 20 years apiece, and in that same year, my former camp foreman, Sinibrukov, was sent off with a whole trainload of unsentenced prisoners from Chelyabinsk to Cherepovets. Months passed and the Zeks worked away, and then one rest day in winter, note the days, another advantage of the OSO, when the frost was cracking, they were driven out into a courtyard and lined up. A newly arrived lieutenant appeared and introduced himself as having come to inform them of their OSO penalties. But he turned out to be a decent sort because he squinted at their thin footwear and at the sun's rays in the steaming frost and said, "Well, anyway, men, why should you freeze out here? The OSO gave you all 10 years apiece. There are just a very, very few who got 8. You understand? Disperse."